The wind screams up here. It claws at your cloak, snatches your breath, and turns every heartbeat into a drum of terror. One wrong step, one slip of the boot on slick clay, and you'd fall hundreds of feet onto the stones below. No rope, no mercy, just silence after the scream, and yet men climbed here willingly, day after day, to build a roof for God. They were the tilers, unsung craftsmen who worked closer to heaven than any priest ever did. While the clergy prayed in marble halls and nobles knelt in embroidered robes, these men balanced on thin wooden beams beneath an endless sky, their hands raw from clay, their faces burned by the sun. They were ordinary laborers, but they gave form to eternity. When you stand beneath a medieval church roof today, you stand beneath the work of men who risked everything for faith, wages, and pride. The medieval world worshipped upward. From every town square rose the spire of a church, tall, defiant, a finger pointing to heaven. To the people below, it was God's house. To the men who built it, it was an altar of danger. Churches were more than places of prayer. They were monuments of ambition. Stone by stone, beam by beam, they reached higher, as if the sky itself could be tamed by craftsmanship. But that height demanded sacrifice, and it was the tilers who paid it. A medieval roof wasn't a flat plain. It was a mountain of angles and ridges, steep and treacherous. The tiles had to fit perfectly, each one aligned to shed rain and bear the weight of snow. And all of it had to be done from above, balanced on timber, often without railings, while the wind roared through the half-built arches. Imagine standing on a narrow beam, hammer in hand, your entire world reduced to the stretch of roof before you and the sky all around. The stones below look like grave markers. You know they could be. There were no safety lines, no scaffolds built to modern logic, just ropes tied to beams or to the waist of a fellow worker. Sometimes they tied nothing at all. The work was too cramped for caution. A single misjudged step could send a man tumbling into eternity. And still they climbed, because roofs had to be finished before winter, because the Lord demanded it, because the church's spire couldn't shine with heaven's promise, while its halls were open to rain. But danger alone wasn't what drew them. There was something else, something wordless and sacred. To work on a church roof was to touch heaven, quite literally. The tilers saw what no priest ever did. The curve of the earth below, the clouds passing close enough to reach. For them, faith wasn't in the sermon, but in the structure. They built their devotion with their bodies, every tile a prayer laid in clay. Below them, villagers would look up, squinting at tiny figures moving across the sky, like insects against the sunlit stone. They whispered blessings, or sometimes warnings. Many roofs had already claimed men. They called them sky martyrs, taken by God while serving his house. But even that fear became reverence. To die building a church was a kind of salvation, a poor man's sainthood. When dusk fell, the tilers would climb down, muscles shaking, faces gray with dust and soot. They'd drink their ale in silence, staring at the looming silhouette of the church they had helped shape. Tomorrow they'd climb again, one tile higher, one breath nearer the heavens. The world below barely remembered their names, but the sky did. For centuries, the roofs they risked their lives to build have outlived their bones, proof that faith, when built by hands, can endure longer than any prayer spoken beneath it. At dawn, the tilers began their ascent. The cathedral's unfinished towers loomed like giants over the mist, their spires cutting through the gray sky. The men climbed in silence, boots scraping against wooden scaffolds slick with dew. Each breath of wind reminded them how thin the line was between work and death. The ropes creaked, pulleys groaned, and below, far, far below, the town was still asleep. They climbed not just to build, but to serve. To tile the roof of a church was to touch divinity with calloused hands. No prayer, no sermon could match the intimacy of standing among the clouds, laying clay above the very altar of God. For these men, labor was faith made physical. Every tile was an offering. Every climb was a pilgrimage. The scaffolds themselves were feats of improvisation. Planks lashed together with rope, timber poles wedged into the stone joints of the cathedral's walls. They swayed with every gust of wind, sighing like the ribs of some massive beast. From the ground, the workers looked like birds clinging to the sky. But up there, balance was everything. A moment's distraction, a gust, a glance downward, could send a man to his death before he even screamed. Still, they moved with confidence born of repetition. Tools tied to their belts, tiles stacked in wicker baskets, they climbed, passed, and placed in a rhythm older than memory. The foreman's voice cut through the wind, steady and low. "Mind your footing. Keep your line. Trust the beam." It wasn't instruction. It was prayer. The clay tiles were hoisted in bundles, pulled up by ropes wound around wooden drums. The youngest apprentices did this work, straining with every pull, their palms burning. It was said that a boy could not become a man until he'd sent his first tile skyward. When the basket reached the top, a tiler would untie it with numb fingers, the clay cold against his skin, and begin the sacred choreography of placement. The higher they climbed, the thinner the air seemed to feel. Up there, sound changed, softer, lonelier. Even the church bells below were muffled by distance. The only constant was the wind, tugging at cloaks and sleeves, whispering through the half-finished beams. Sometimes men talked to it, half in jest, half in fear, calling it an old spirit that tested their courage. To slip was to vanish. No one fell gracefully. There was no chance for rescue. The others would watch in frozen silence as the shape of a man disappeared, his tools tumbling after him, the sound swallowed by distance. Then someone would murmur, "God keep him," and the work would continue. For every man lost, another would climb. But for those who survived, the view was unlike anything on earth. From the top, the world spread out in all directions, the patchwork of fields, the thin thread of rivers, the smoke rising from cottages far below. The tilers said it made them humble. They could see everything that God saw, yet they were still just men clinging to wood and clay. When the sun broke through the clouds, the tiles shimmered like gold. The church roof glowed as though heaven itself had descended. And the tilers, squinting in the blinding light, felt pride. Theirs was the highest craft, the closest to the divine. And for a few moments each day, they stood between earth and eternity. Before the tilers ever set foot on a roof, their work began deep in the earth. Every tile they laid started as mud, humble clay pulled from riverbanks and pits on the edge of the village. The same soil that fed the crops also built the heavens above them. It was a beautiful irony. The ground became the sky. Clay was heavy, stubborn, and alive. When wet, it clung to everything. When dry, it cracked and betrayed its maker. The craftsmen who shaped it, the clay burners, molders, and kilnmen, knew it like a friend and an enemy. They worked barefoot in the pits, turning the clay with shovels, trampling it underfoot to press out air and stone. The best clay had a certain texture, dense but smooth, pliant but strong. The older workers could tell by touch alone, by the weight in their hands or the sound it made when slapped against wood. The raw material was pressed into wooden molds, each shaped to match the curve of a roof tile. Some molds bore the mark of the workshop, a symbol, a cross, or even the initials of the master. Others were plain, anonymous, made for speed. Once molded, the tiles were left to dry in long rows under the open sky. Sunlight hardened their surface. Wind whispered through the lines, carrying the scent of earth and ash. If rain came too soon, the tiles cracked and died before they ever reached the fire. The kiln was where clay met its trial by flame. It was a monstrous thing, a dome of stone and brick, its mouth blackened by centuries of use. Inside, wood and peat burned for days without rest. Men stoked the fires through the night, faces glowing orange in the heat, shirts soaked in sweat. The temperature had to be watched by instinct. There were no dials, only color. When the flames burned white, the clay turned hard. When they burned red, it stayed soft and useless. The kilnmaster judged by sight alone, his eyes trained over decades of devotion. When the firing was done, the tiles emerged transformed, no longer mud, but something close to eternal. Each one rang like pottery when struck, strong enough to resist storms, yet light enough to climb with. Some were left plain, dull red or brown. Others were glazed with ash, salt, or lead, primitive chemistry that turned the surface glossy and waterproof. A good batch was treasure. A failed one was ruin. Even as they cooled, the tiles were sacred to the men who made them. Many believed that the kiln itself was dangerous to the soul, a place where the fire of creation met the fire of hell. To guard against misfortune, some workers carved small crosses or faces into the first tiles of a batch, gifts to whatever spirit ruled the flame. A superstition, perhaps. But when your life depended on the mercy of heat and chance, faith was the only tool that never broke. Once ready, the tiles were stacked in carts, their sharp edges chiming softly as they touched. Boys and oxen hauled them to the churchyard, where tilers waited to carry them skyward. Each one was a fragment of earth reborn through human hands, proof that even the simplest clay could, with enough fire, become something divine. And when those tiles finally touched the roof, glinting in the sun hundreds of feet above the ground, they carried with them the story of everyone who had touched them, the diggers, the molders, the fire tenders, the tilers. In that way, every church roof was not just a shield against rain, but a monument to the hands of men who turned mud into immortality. If the clay tiles were the skin of the church, then the timber frames were its bones, the invisible skeleton that carried all the weight of heaven. Long before a single tile touched the rooftop, carpenters worked like surgeons of wood, cutting, shaping, and joining beams into patterns of strength and grace. They didn't have blueprints. Their plans lived in memory, passed from one master to another through generations, like secret prayers whispered in sawdust. The process began in the forest. Timber was chosen with reverence. Not every tree was worthy of the church. Oak was prized above all, dense, slow-growing, unyielding. Carpenters would tap the trunks with mallets, listening to the echo within. A hollow sound meant weakness. A clear, ringing tone meant life. They cut in winter when the sap was low to keep the wood from splitting. Each tree fell with ceremony, sometimes with a prayer, for in medieval minds, every tree had a spirit, and felling one without respect was a dangerous act. Back at the building site, the timber was transformed by hand. Axes, adzes, and saws sang through the air, biting into bark and grain. Each beam was shaped to fit another, using nothing but wooden pegs and the geometry of trust. Nails were rare, expensive, and often reserved for the church doors. Instead, joints were carved with astonishing precision, mortise and tenon, scarf and lap, designs that could hold firm for centuries without a single drop of iron. Imagine the scene. half-finished arches rising over scaffolds, men balancing on frames as thick as a man's waist, shouting to each other across dizzying heights. Below, apprentices passed up pegs and mallets. Above, the master carpenter moved with slow, deliberate confidence. He could read the wood like scripture, its knots, its flaws, its hidden strength. Every strike of his adze was both correction and communion. When two beams met, they were joined not just mechanically, but symbolically. The act of pegging them together was often accompanied by a blessing. Some builders would even hide small charms or coins inside the joints, offerings to ensure the roof's endurance. Archaeologists have found these relics centuries later: tiny iron crosses, scraps of parchment, even locks of hair, tucked away where no eye would ever see them. The result was an architecture of impossible elegance. The wooden trusses that supported the stone vaults were feats of invisible genius. They bore tons of weight in perfect balance, curving and branching like the ribs of a giant creature. To stand beneath them, even unfinished, was to glimpse the living skeleton of the church, a cathedral not of stone, but of wood and air. And yet these timbers were never meant to be seen. Once the tiles were laid, the roof sealed, and the ceilings plastered, the carpenter's work vanished into shadow. Their art was sacrifice, perfection hidden behind beauty. The peasants below would never know the names of the men whose beams held up their prayers. But if the roof held strong through storm and snow, if no drop of rain ever fell upon the altar, then those nameless craftsmen had achieved their quiet immortality. They built houses for God with no nails, no steel, and no recognition. Only patience, precision, and the whispered faith that wood, humble, living wood, could hold the weight of heaven itself. When the storms rolled in, the roof became a battlefield. The sky darkened without warning, the wind howled through the rafters, and rain hammered against the clay tiles like arrows against a shield. In those moments, the true genius and the fragile courage of medieval construction revealed itself. Because everything depended on balance, on friction, on the unseen geometry of weight and wind. And those men, who had worked without nails, had to trust that their craft would hold. Storms in the Middle Ages weren't small affairs. They were forces of terror. Lightning struck towers like divine punishment, wind tore through villages, and roofs, if built poorly, simply vanished into the night. Chroniclers wrote of entire churches losing their crowns, their tiles scattered across fields, their beams snapped like twigs. For the peasants who huddled inside, the sound of the storm wasn't just frightening, it was apocalyptic. The roof was their last defense between earth and the wrath of heaven. But those who built well, who understood the language of air and structure, created miracles of endurance. The secret lay in flexibility. The wooden frames, joined without nails, could move. They creaked, groaned, and bent beneath the wind, but rarely broke. Iron would have snapped under the pressure. Wood breathed. The peasants below might pray for mercy, but the roof above them danced with the storm. The tiles, too, played their part. Each one overlapped the next like scales on a dragon's back, shedding water and resisting wind. Medieval tilers had a superstition. Lay the tiles as if they'll fly. It meant every placement had to anticipate the wind's pull, every corner aligned with the invisible currents that swept the church. It wasn't science, it was intuition, passed down through muddy hands and sunburned generations. When lightning struck, which it often did, the church became a spectacle of light and fury. Fire was the greatest fear. Dry thatch, wooden beams, and tarred pitch turned roofs into tinder boxes. In some places, villagers would climb ladders mid-storm to pour water over the tiles, praying their courage outweighed their madness. Others simply watched and waited, whispering that if the fire took the roof, perhaps God had finally spoken his judgment. But when the storm passed and dawn broke, the survivors often found the church still standing, the roof intact, the tiles barely disturbed. They would marvel, not understanding how something built of mud and wood could defy the sky itself. And in truth, it was because those builders had understood something deeper than physics. They had built in harmony with nature, not against it. Their roofs bent but did not break, swayed but did not fall. Each creak of timber, each dripping tile, was a dialogue with the elements. The peasants who slept beneath those roofs didn't just find shelter. They found reassurance that even in the most violent chaos, human hands, guided by patience and humility, could still build something the storm could not destroy. And in that, there was a lesson greater than any sermon. Cathedrals and cottages alike reminded people that survival was not defiance, but endurance. The medieval builder's wisdom was simple yet profound. You cannot stop the wind. You must build with it. The roofs that survived the centuries did so not through power, but through grace. And every time a storm passed and the church bells still rang, the villagers knew their faith, like their roofs, had held. When the last tile was laid and the scaffolds came down, the noise that had filled the churchyard for years vanished. The hammer strikes, the shouting, the songs of the tilers, all faded into silence. What remained was the sound of wind slipping between clay and beam, the faint creak of wood settling, and the echo of something divine lingering in the air. The builders had vanished from sight, but their work stood like a prayer carved into the sky. Most of them never saw their roofs again once they descended. Their hands, cracked and scarred, turned to other tasks, repairing cottages, barns, mills. They were ghosts who walked among the living, while their true legacy floated high above, untouched by time. The villagers below never knew their names. The priests who blessed the church rarely remembered to bless the men who made it possible. Yet without them, even the mightiest cathedral would have been no more than a skeleton of stone. Years passed. Rain fell, seasons shifted, and the roofs endured. The men who had balanced on beams above the clouds were buried in the same earth from which their clay had come. But their roofs did not forget. Some of those medieval structures, built entirely without nails, still stand today, defying centuries of storms, wars, and neglect. Their beams hold the memory of those who crafted them, their joints still locked tight with wooden pegs carved by hands long turned to dust. Historians often marvel at the precision of medieval carpentry, the mathematical elegance achieved without rulers or compasses, the craftsmanship so exact that a beam cut in the 13th century still fits perfectly in the 21st. Yet behind that mastery lay something deeper. Devotion. To build a roof for a church was to join your labor to eternity. The tilers and carpenters may not have owned the land, but they built the heavens above it. And then there's the silence, the kind of silence only ancient buildings can hold. Walk into a medieval church today and listen. You might think it's empty, but if you wait, you'll hear it. The quiet groan of old timber, the whisper of wind over tiles, the soft ticking of age. These are not the sounds of decay. They are the breath of memory. The building still alive, still whispering the names of those who shaped it. Each tile, each beam, is a letter in a forgotten story. Together they form the language of endurance. The peasants and craftsmen who built without nails didn't just create roofs. They built symbols of unity. Their strength came not from iron, but from interlocking trust. One piece supporting another, every joint relying on its neighbor. It's the same principle that held their villages together. And maybe that's why their roofs survived so long. Because they were built with the same faith that built their world. Faith that things could endure if they were bound not by force, but by balance. The builders didn't need their names carved in stone. The sound of rain on their roofs, centuries later, was monument enough. Those who climb into the attics of ancient churches today still find their work intact. Pegs firm, joints tight, beams straight as arrows. No nails, no rust, just the steady heartbeat of craftsmanship that outlasted empires. They built houses for God, but they also built lessons for men. That true strength lies not in iron, but in patience, humility, and the quiet will to endure. For centuries, historians thought medieval peasants built through luck, superstition, and tradition. But step inside the skeleton of a 13th century roof, and you'll see a different story, one of science disguised as simplicity. These men, who could neither read nor write, mastered physics through experience, geometry through instinct, and engineering through necessity. Their hands were their textbooks, their failures their teachers. The secret of a nail-less roof lay in tension and compression. Concepts unknown by name, but perfectly understood in practice. Every joint, every peg, every slanting beam was designed to redirect weight, to balance pressure between earth and sky. The great trusses formed triangles, the strongest shape in nature, a pattern the peasants copied from observation, not diagrams. They saw how branches split yet supported, how roots braced the trunk, and they imitated the forest's logic in their work. They used no rulers, no precise mathematics. Instead, they worked by the rule of thumb, by ropes knotted at set lengths, by shadows cast on the ground. A carpenter could measure an angle simply by eyeing where the sun struck his timber. The golden ratio wasn't something they calculated. It was something they felt. To them, balance wasn't a number. It was harmony. Then came the sound. The rhythm of wood under the adze, the hiss of the plane, the thump of pegs driven home. Each tool had its song, and a master could tell if a beam was sound by the tone it sang. If the pitch was deep and hollow, the wood would split. If it rang bright and sharp, it would endure centuries. Their science was not recorded in parchment, but in echoes. Even their choice of materials held secret genius. They used oak where the roof bent, ash where it needed to flex, willow where it needed to resist rot. The arrangement of these woods wasn't random. It was deliberate, learned through the slow trial of generations. The same way bees learned to build honeycombs, these craftsmen learned to build cathedrals. And then there was the air itself. Medieval roofs breathed. Unlike modern sealed constructions, they allowed wind to flow through, carrying away moisture and preventing decay. That was no accident. Builders noticed that enclosed barns rotted faster, so they built their churches like lungs, alive, circulating, ever in balance. In doing so, they accidentally achieved what modern architects call passive ventilation. To this day, engineers study these structures, wondering how they lasted so long. Some call it luck, others art. But the truth is simpler. Necessity bred understanding. When you have no iron, no machines, no second chances, you learn to make perfection by hand. Perhaps the most remarkable thing isn't that they built without nails, but that they didn't need them. They knew that nails eventually rust, but wood, when joined to wood, could outlive empires. Each joint they carved, each peg they drove, was an act of quiet intelligence. No parchment recorded it, no scholar praised it, but the knowledge lived on, passed from father to son, from apprentice to master, until it became as natural as breathing. Their roofs were more than shelter. They were proof that knowledge can exist without words. That wisdom doesn't always come from books or kings, but from hands hardened by labor and eyes sharpened by the will to endure. And so, when we look up today at the great roofs of medieval Europe, still standing, still strong, we see more than architecture. We see the triumph of humble genius, the unseen science of the common man who, without education or iron, built the bones of eternity. Centuries have passed since those men last climbed into the clouds, and yet their work remains, enduring, silent, magnificent. The same beams that creaked under medieval hands now hold firm beneath the weight of modern storms. They have outlived their builders, their kings, and the very faith that first inspired them. While empires crumbled, while armies marched and vanished, these roofs stood. They endured not because of wealth or might, but because they were made with reverence, precision, and trust in the materials of the earth. Many of those wooden frames still breathe with life. In the dark attics of cathedrals, where sunlight filters through the dust, the air smells of oak, tar, and centuries of worship. There, you can see the grain of wood shaped by hand, the marks of adzes and chisels still visible, as if the craftsman only stepped away yesterday. Some of the beams are so ancient that their trees began growing when Rome was still young. These were not just roofs. They were time machines, carrying human intention across 1,000 years. Historians and architects who study them today speak of awe. The joints, they say, fit so tightly you can't slip a blade between them. The pegs have swollen with age, locking the beams together with greater strength than iron. In their design, you find not the chaos of guessing, but the calm perfection of understanding, proof that knowledge, once earned through the rhythm of hands, can last longer than memory. But perhaps the most haunting truth is this. For all their endurance, these roofs were never built to last forever. The peasants who made them believed everything decayed: wood, stone, flesh, even kingdoms. And yet they built anyway. They built with the faith that if their roofs protected one generation, it was enough. They could not have known they were building for us, for a future that would look up and still see their fingerprints in the beams. Their churches became tombs of time, their cottages museums of humility. Even the smallest peasant hut, long collapsed into earth, leaves behind clues, impressions of timber in the soil, fragments of tile hardened by fire. Archaeologists call them artifacts, but in truth, they are confessions, proof that survival doesn't always belong to the grandest works, but to the most honest ones. Today, modern builders, armed with machines, steel, and digital plans, study these medieval structures with reverence. They marvel that such roofs stand without nails, without blueprints, without calculation. What they find, again and again, is not magic, but mindfulness. Every cut was made with purpose. Every joint carried balance. These were men who understood that to build something lasting, one must build with respect for the material, for the world, and for time itself. And that is why these roofs have outlived empires. They were not made to dominate the world, but to belong to it. They bent with the wind, breathed with the seasons, and rested upon the earth that birthed them. So, when you walk beneath one of those ancient ceilings, whether in a grand cathedral or a forgotten barn, listen closely. The beams will creak softly, and if you let yourself believe, you might hear it. The echo of axes in the forest, the rasp of planes against oak, the heartbeat of the men who built eternity from mud and wood. They built without nails, without glory, and without promise of reward. And yet what they left behind still stands. That is the truest definition of immortality.